First up, I'd like to welcome Mx Vassili Crispi with their talk, Queerness in Surgery.
I need a microphone, is that right? Fantastic. Sorry, I usually walk a lot, I do apologise. So I'm not able to do that today. Hi, nice to meet you. No, don't worry, it's fine. Hi, I'm Vassili. I'm one of the academic neurosurgery trainees in West Midlands. Do you want me to admit people? Amazing. I'm one of the academic neurosurgery trainees in West Midlands. I'll tell you a little bit about myself as we go along. I'm just going to start with a couple of disclaimers. As probably you will hear from the talks today, they're really intense topics. What I'll be talking about today can be triggering. If it is triggering, I'm sorry, I think it's really important that we talk about it. And we talk about the reality of facts of identifying as queer within surgery and medicine overall. The second disclaimer is that, to summarize the entire talk, is that we have a lot of doors to open, yet a long way yet to go. And unfortunately, we're doing a really rubbish job at the moment for a number of reasons, usually because queerness is the one forgotten area that nobody really cares about when we're talking about widening participation within medicine and our specialty. So go ahead. Amazing. I've got a couple of declarations of interest just because I've decided that they've affected so much my training to date that I'm going to put them in, and this is just my plug-in. My biggest waste of time and money throughout training so far has been a PG cert in health research. If you're ever offered one, I strongly recommend you don't do it. Any PG cert, to be completely honest. Invest in doing a master's is something more useful if you get the money. And A&E rotation, I've gained absolutely nothing from. I think that was my experience in Birmingham as a hospital. I'm sorry, hopefully this is not fully recorded. It's not going to come back to me. And the MRCS examinations as a neurosurgeon that were utterly useless. Now, back to it. So I'm originally from Italy, if you've not picked up from my accent. I've been in the UK for about 12 years, I think, so far. It's been a brilliant journey, but I'm from the middle of nowhere in Sicily, in the south of Italy. My hometown is called Piazza Arena. It's a really dying town, unfortunately, growing older from that perspective because all of the younger generations are flying away, but it's effectively known for a beautiful Roman villa. All the floors are covered in mosaics, and this is some of the areas where, for example, we actually discovered that the Romans invented bikini for playing sports and not the French at the beginning of the last century. So hey ho. When I was a kid, I was initially interested in doing either becoming a naval engineer because I was absolutely fascinated and slightly obsessed with the Titanic. I also wanted to become an astronaut, but eventually became a surgeon, alongside as a backup option. What a shame. Mandatory photo that everyone needs to take the first time they ever go into theatre. This is my first time in theatre as a first-year medical student. I was fascinated by neurosurgery thanks to Ben Carson. He still is a pediatric neurosurgeon across in the States. He's most famously known for being the first person that has successfully separated co-joint twins joint at the head, because all previous procedures have failed, and unfortunately either one of the siblings or both have perished. Now, he's a very controversial person. Unfortunately, he's run as part of and he's been part of the cabinet for Trump during the last office. He's awfully racist himself, despite being a black man. So, there's a couple of things there that unfortunately doesn't make him the best role model, but yet someone perhaps to aspire to in terms of things to achieve in life. So I did my high school in Italy. I was lucky enough that my parents were really keen. My mum was an English language teacher, never helped me with English from that perspective, so as a disclaimer, but she was really keen for me to do an exchange year abroad. So when I was in my penultimate year of high school, the equivalent of AS, sixth form, I came across to the UK. I went to the beautiful Isle of Wight. It was absolutely stunning. I didn't get a choice where I went, but it was absolutely brilliant. This was my biology class, and I had an amazing time there. And it really gave me the skill and the experience, also from my work experience, to be able to apply for med school here in the UK. Nonetheless, I was completely clueless. My first interview, off by chance, was in Aberdeen. I really struggled with the Scottish accent. It is clear I didn't get a place in Aberdeen, but it was quite an experience. And my dad came with me from literally Sicily to -10 degrees when we went to Northern Scotland. But eventually I messed up a little bit on my UCAS application. I entered my AS grades as if it was A-level grades, and therefore was rejected both by Cardiff, Kill and Hull York. But Hull York came back to me because they spotted the error, and they offered me an interview the week after I did my interview in Aberdeen. So I literally flew back, sat on my exams back home, and flew back to York. And luckily enough, I actually got a job. I got a place at Hull York, and I'm incredibly thankful for it because it's been a great opportunity for me. I knew that anatomy was some of the areas where I was particularly passionate. Unfortunately, there was not a lot of teaching within medical school, so I decided to do an intercalated degree. And eventually, I found myself in effectively the right place, right time by buggering people as much as I could, knowing that I wanted to do neurosurgery. So I found myself a supervisor for a foundation program, academic foundation program in West Yorkshire. And then the first time I applied for ST1, unfortunately, I did not get in, but I worked on the application and got in last time, and I'm about to complete my ST1 year. And I decided to pursue academia a little bit more. So I'm actually one of the academic clinical fellows in West Midlands, focusing on brain tumours. What unfortunately we don't see is that there's a lot more to it. And this is some of the intersectionality that Jade was talking about, that all of you will have and perhaps recognize in yourselves. But something that I didn't quite realize is how much being queer actually identified me along the way. I identify as a queer person, I identify as genderqueer in terms of sexuality, and something that has taken me quite a long time to actually figure out for myself. And I'll tell you a little bit more in a second. I was outed in high school. I was then outed again when I landed in my first couple of weeks of Freshers Week, effectively, of medical school, by someone that clearly saw that I was camp and just on a night out when they were drunk, told everyone that I was gay, despite me not having given any consent for it. So I didn't really get a choice. Before even coming to the UK, I was told that it was just going to be a waste of time from my teachers in Sicily, in the middle of nowhere. Remember, it was going to be a waste of time. And, you know, I'm really glad to be here today in the first instance. When Brexit happened, it was the first time that I ever thought of myself as an immigrant. I never thought myself as being anyone else other than European. UK was in Europe. We were just going to go across the channel in the same way I could have taken a flight to Rome and studied in Rome. It didn't make a difference. But yet overnight in my second year of uni, I felt like an immigrant for the first time. And then it all started. And all of the comments that I've ever gotten about being queer and wanting to do neurosurgery or academia has never been from neurosurgery itself. So that's my disclaimer. I've never actually faced any discrimination in my specialty. It's always come from somewhere else, the perception of other people around. You're a bit too gay for surgery. And that's something that triggered a colleague of mine and I to look into the literature that I'll tell you a little bit more about. During my master's in clinical anatomy, I also realized that actually a lot of the expectations, a lot of the unhealthy behaviors and perceptions that we have in Italy, it actually affected me across time. And I realized actually I had an eating disorder that I came on top of, luckily. But what was really fascinating is that so clinicians as well as counselors are really no use, for example, dealing with people that are like we are in medicine, who are likely to be perfectionists, who are aiming for a good portfolio, but at the same time might have a disorder, such an eating disorder, is based, for example, on perfectionism. And I really struggle with that because the advice, well, perhaps you should not do neurosurgery, which from my perspective would have absolutely annihilated my mental health at that point in time. I came out as genderqueer during my foundation years. It's taken quite some time for me to get that. And some of those perceptions, in terms of pronouns, is he, they. Some of those perceptions were on, for example, the toxic labeling that happens within the gay community, something that I didn't ever fit in. I always felt like it was somewhere else. And then now I kind of fit. I think I've got a place where I fit effectively, but now more than ever, I appreciate how it actually influences me. As far as I know, there are 5 out people in neurosurgery across the entirety of the 4 nations here in the UK. I'm sure there'll be some more that have been closeted across time, but unfortunately the perception is very different. And as you move across different specialties, you will know that a little bit more. So my colleague Will and I in medical school, he's a trans man working in northern Scotland. We started looking around and we actually identified there was no one in medical school that looked anywhere like us. The very first time I met anyone of color since living from Sicily, there was the same level of attainment. So a fellow colleague of mine in my first year was here in the UK. I never experienced them openly at ethnic diversity in society, for example. The first time that I saw someone understanding of intersectionality was my professor of anatomy here in medical school at Hull York, and he was a black man. He was absolutely fantastic. He was really supportive to help me actually come to terms with coming out, for example. The first time I saw anyone queer at a point of leadership within medical school was the subsequent director of the same program of clinical anatomy, who has since moved across to Australia, and it's a really big loss for my medical school, I think. But so it's taken quite some time before realizing actually we do exist, we are out there, and it's really important to be visible. And ever since leaving medical school, I now realized that the dean I used to work with, who has since stepped down, was a queer woman, and the now dean of the medical school is a queer man. And I'm going to be using queer as a late umbrella term to talk about gayness, lesbian identity, and so forth, just to be a little bit more inclusive from that perspective. But I think as a student, for me, looking back, it would have been really important to actually know that back then, that you would have been able to actually achieve those roles, and there were challenges that you can actually overcome. So just to give you a rough idea what it looks like, hopefully we're still okay. So we've made really good progress. We're taking significant steps back in the last 5 years, certainly. But we have repealed Section 28. We can now talk about some form of LGBTQ plus education, sexual education, very limited, unfortunately, since we're taking steps back. We've got same-sex marriage. It is no longer illegal to donate blood if you're a man who has sex with men. So we remove some of that stigma. But unfortunately, the international discourse around transgender identities has really worsened the current situation. So we're looking at barriers to gender recognition. We're looking at the CAST report, which was an illiterate report, incredibly biased against transgender individuals, that has been mandated and commissioned and published by the Conservative Party, and is effectively a transphobic agenda against transgender people. We're looking at the interim guidance by the EHRC and the Supreme Court ruling coming from the cases in Scotland that effectively are now telling us that women are only those with a biological sex identified as women, which of course we know that from a scientific point of view is not the case. The sex is the addition of a number of characteristics, sexual characteristics, hormonal changes, as well as secondary sexual characteristics, external and internal genitalia. Is much more complex than that. And unfortunately, this is worsening the discourse, not only here in the UK, but across the world. What it means for us, well, we know thanks to the 2021 census that the number of people that identify as LGBTQ plus has slightly gone higher. We have now finally included those that identify as with a different gender than that assigned at birth, and we know that that number is higher than it ever been recorded. But actually, we know those numbers are actually underestimation because of the international discourse. A lot of people fear their ability to be able to actually be out, even with these national censuses. If you're identifying within society, your healthcare is likely to suffer. So I'm actually going to go to this one. So you're more likely to report mental health needs. Lesbian women are less likely to ever receive, for example, a cervical smear because of the discrimination that they face as they enter the healthcare system. LGBTQ plus men are far more likely to have, for example, stigma around STIs due to over-sexualization of their identities within the media. So there are a number of barriers that we will see day in, day out. And what I hope for you to take away is that there's a lot that you can do, even if you don't identify as queer, just for your own patients, but most importantly for your own colleagues. What about doctors? The states tell us a little bit more. And what we found shockingly with my colleague Will and I, what we found really shocking was the fact that back in 2022, when we published this, there were 5 pieces of literature published in the academic domain around LGBTQ plus doctors or students. That was it. There are millions of publications, scientific publications out there, and only 5 are pertaining LGBTQ plus identities. It is really shocking. We know from the States that the numbers match more or less around the population. Those that are willing to be out and self-identify in those surveys are about 3%, dropping down in terms of transgender numbers a little bit lower. We roughly estimate there's about 1 to 2% of transgender folks amongst us in society. But reality is that we don't have the data to back up the intersectionality. We don't have the data to actually back up the evidence around our experiences. In terms of change within society, luckily, gender changes usually happen a little bit earlier, so we can look at advances within the societal experiences. You're looking at gender in the first instance, and then race and ethnicity, and unfortunately, queer identities will come a little bit later. So this is a paper that was published, I think, in 2023, and it's looking around the percentage of consultants and female trainees within different specialties. And here we're looking at trainees themselves. And if you look around the bottom, so I'm going to look on the screen so other people can actually see. If you look around the bottom, Wonder what? Cardiothoracics, neurosurgery, and trauma and orthopedics around the bottom, where we're actually looking only about 5 to 10% of trainees are female. So that's quite shocking, isn't it? When we're actually looking at ophthalmology, going up to 30%. And things are improving because when we look at consultants' numbers, those are a little bit higher. So we are slowly getting there. But what does it look like in terms of potentially achieving that equality? Well, if we project the numbers going forward, some specialties will achieve a little bit earlier. So if you're interested in general surgery or urology, you might get that a little bit earlier. But if you look at the more traditional, really hard to permeate with EDI's concepts, so especially such as neurosurgery, TNO, and cardiothoracics, we're waiting until 2050 in order to be able to achieve just the same number of female trainees as consultants at that point in time. Nothing more. We're just looking at female trainees. We're not talking about intersectionality with race and ethnicity. We're not talking about any other entities. And that's really important because privilege comes with it. Those visible colleagues are the ones that are likely to motivate students as we go along. If we look at sexual orientation, what we do know is that effectively those specialties that are perceived as being familiar, luckily, are the ones that actually LGBTQ plus students are willing to go into. So this is a survey in the States of residents, so students about to become residents, and their LGBTQ plus identities and which specialty they perceive as being more welcoming. And unsurprisingly, psychiatry and medical specialties are right at the top, and unfortunately those that are less welcome, perceived as being less welcoming, therefore they're not being chosen, the surgical specialties are usually around the bottom. Culture is changing, but there's a lot of work to do. So in 2021, the Kennedy report, that was the Royal College of Surgeons Kennedy report was published, and this was quite a big inquiry following some significant concerns around discrimination, primarily around race and ethnicity, but also around bullying within the college itself and within the specialties. And guess how many times anyone mentioned LGBTQ plus identities in it? Only once. That is how many times we were featuring that. And once again, it was, you're a bit too gay for this. So there's always the same thing that unfortunately comes back. A number of recommendations came from the report, and there's a lot of changes that the college is currently making, and that's why, for example, the Royal College of Surgeons Pride in Surgery forums actually exist, and I'm one of the members, and that's why Isabel has invited us to speak to you today. But yet we don't have the data. Once again, we don't know what the experiences on the ground are. And the BMA has concluded in 2022, they published the second survey they ever did on this. And actually this time they focused on the sexual orientation and gender identity within the health profession. Back in 2015, it was the first survey they ever did, but we only focused about LGBT identities. We didn't even think about transgender identities back then. And it took quite some time to go through this. I strongly recommend you do read this, and I'm happy for the slides to be shared later. I strongly recommend you read this. It is a tough read, and we work really hard not to showcase the transphobic views that people, our colleagues, went out of the way for in order to include them in this report. I'll show you why. Sorry. Sorry. So I'll give you a few definitions before we go a little bit further. So transgender is someone that identifies with a gender other than the one they've been assigned at birth. Cisgender is someone that identifies with the same gender they've been assigned at birth. A trans man, therefore, is someone that has been assigned female who now identifies as a man. A trans woman is someone assigned male at birth but identifies as a woman. Non-binary is someone that doesn't fit, does not identify as either male or female. Non-conform is just effectively describing the fact that you do not conform to the societal expectations of your gender, assigned or chosen, and therefore that's where the fluidity comes from. And intersex is something that is really across time has actually been very interwoven with transgender identities, unfortunately. But they're actually someone with internal or external genitalia, so reproductive and sexual anatomy that does not match the gender, the typical definitions of male, female, the gender that is assigned at birth, and is unfortunately intersex people within society incredibly medicalized from that perspective, and there's a lot of work around that. So why I'm telling you we had so many transphobic views in this survey? Well, the reason for that is that when you put it all together, surprisingly, the people that are actually identifying as LGBTQ+ are a very small proportion. There are 1,400 people, either allies or against us, that effectively went out of the way to contribute to this survey. And out of those, out of the 2,500 responses that we had, about a third of them were cisgender heterosexual colleagues that went out of their way to provide their views, either supportive or not. And unfortunately, they weren't always the same. They weren't as supportive as we were hoping for. So what are the experiences that I want to tell you about? Well, unsurprisingly, you probably see a lot of people there. You might identify possibly you're queer, possibly you're out, possibly you're not. And some of them will be very flamboyant, usually gay man most of the time. They'll be very flamboyant. You walk through A&E, you're identified, and most of you queer, most of your colleagues might potentially be queer because A&E is perceived as a very welcoming specialty compared to some of the surgical ones, whilst others are less welcoming. The reality is that less than half of our colleagues are ever out of work in the first instance. And I'll give you some experiences. It's because of the retaliation that we fear for our future. For trans colleagues, it's even worse. Remember that, unfortunately, it is always worse. So what do we think? It's the same way when Black Lives Matter finally came around the corners and all of the Brits finally woke up, oh, we do really have a problem with racism in this country. We thought it was fine, but we really have a problem. It's the same when we look at this. It's like the overwhelming majority of LGBTQ plus colleagues think that there is a problem. There is a significant problem for discrimination, whilst our heterosexual colleagues think, yeah, it's fine. You're included. You've got the same opportunities as I do, without realizing that actually this intersectionality means that we need to work far harder to achieve the same goals. What does that discrimination look like? Well, most of the time it looks like microaggression. Day in, day out, the small comment, the small changes that you need to make to adjust when talking about your sexuality, when talking about your partner, those are the microaggressions. Well, you shouldn't really be seeing that male patient because you're a gay man and it could be seen as sexual assault. It's inappropriate. Or you really shouldn't be going in pediatrics, you're a gay man, you'll be seen as a pedophile, which I had once actually. Unfortunately, when we actually look at what our experiences then evolve into, there is a lot of abuse. And I think one of the areas that is really underreported within LGBTQ plus doctors is the level of actual sexual abuse. If you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. Is from on the Royal College of Surgeons bulletin from 2022. There is a report, an editorial by Simon Fleming and Becky. Can't remember her surname, sorry. Both of them trainees who have denounced the amount of sexual assault and abuse that happens within our ranks. I told you this was going to be heavy, sorry. So what are the challenges? Well, in the first instance, you don't feel like you can be out. And that's for a number of reasons. There's going to be assumptions, you're going to be, what do you think is portrayed in the media in the first instance? Because that's the first time anyone usually comes into contact with LGBTQ plus identities. It is your flamboyant gays who are sexually promiscuous, who are going out in a club. And I'm sorry for using those stereotypes as well, because I've always struggled with that definition to be taken seriously, because everyone is always expecting me that I'm not going to be in a stable relationship. I always want to be go out partying. Why you wanted to do that if you're a party animal? Why do you want to be in neurosurgery? And that's something that personally I've always struggled to come to terms with as a teenager, because I didn't see those same identities translated within the LGBTQ plus portion of our profession. All of the stereotyping, unfortunately, is translated in our clinical competency. And therefore, either intrinsically, LGBTQ plus colleagues feel that we have to work harder in order to be taken seriously from a clinical competence point of view, or our competence is automatically assumed to be less than our straight colleagues. And that, of course, affects your confidence in the work that you do, affects your ability to actually believe that you can achieve some of the same goals that heterosexual cis colleagues are able to do. Trans colleagues are misgendered all the time. I know my name is quite unusual. I've lost count the number of times I've been misgendered as a woman all the time. Unfortunately, my name is also female, so it makes my life quite easy at the moment being genderqueer. But unfortunately, you get misgendered all the time. When you do explain, actually, I would prefer for you to use they as a pronoun. They always use the wrong one. We now have more colleagues that are coming out as transgender. They're transitioning within the system, and some of them have had incredibly supportive experiences. Potentially, they would have never transitioned in the first instance had they not had supportive experiences from their fellow colleagues. But most of them are either very junior, so usually the transitional students, or they're transitioning once they are consultants on the other end. And I've got a colleague of mine who is now who has now been appointed as a local consultant, who is really struggling with that transition because they're terrified of transitioning from a supportive team where they've been training as a surgical trainee towards a different team, but they might not be accepting them from that perspective. So you fear about what specialty you're going to be choosing. Do you want to fight day in, day out your identity, having to explain all the time why that's the case, that your stereotypes is completely wrong? Are you going to be able to access the same opportunities? Because I was too gay for academia, and yet I am an ACF in neurosurgery at the moment. And either intrinsically or opportunistically, you get excluded for projects as a result of either being a troublemaker, a potential troublemaker, or simply not being the person that they feel that they're able to go down to the pub and have a pint with. Because just in surgery, unfortunately, the stereotype is that the overwhelming majority of our colleagues and bosses are white, straight men, who want to go to the pub and have a pint effectively. And that's the same kind of behavior that you see when you go to conferences, where effectively most of the socializing, most of the networking opportunities take place, but perhaps it's something that you don't identify with, or you're actually terrified of being part of, especially if you've been abused in those same circumstances. The discrimination is anything, and it can go from banter to full-on sexual assault and abuse in the workplace. And you might have heard of, for example, there's been a neurosurgeon actually in Australia that has been barred off because of the physical and sexual abuse that it was conducting in the theatre over the years. And as whistleblowers actually came up, they've been able to put together some of the cases, and just on four people, they've been able to strike him off actually on that side. But imagine how many people have actually gone through under their wing and effectively been abused as a result of this. And then eventually we might find ourselves reporting incidents. And I'll tell you a little bit more about it because it's quite disappointing. I do want to go through some of these quotes. I'm sorry, they are strong. So as a senior registrar referred dismissively to me as to gay men as faggots, raised with hospital, was dismissed as said registrar was experiencing a lot of stress, so we need to be understanding. No support is given to me or any of the other LGBTQ plus colleagues identified as this. How many times have you seen abuse being excused? It's a very stressful operation. It's a very stressful environment. It's a one-off. It never is a one-off from that perspective. My educational supervisor thought it was funny for people to use they, them pronouns when talking about me. She refused to use they, them, saying that I'm obviously female, so she would use she, her. She also said that if I wouldn't use male or female pronouns, that she would refer to me as it. Imagine being an F1 doctor in that specialty that you aspire to, and unfortunately, that's the main barrier that you encounter. It will be inappropriate for me to intimately examine a male patients and supervise because I'm gay, and comments about risk contracting HIV from me in theatre. As a lesbian, I thought the assumption that I would not have children helped me overcome the massive amounts of sexism in my surgical specialty. As a senior management, I was told I was mentally unwell and probably a pervert because I'm trans. I ironically love the discourse in the public domain at the moment that trans men are wanting to enter women's toilets in order to rape them, especially in the States where effectively rapists are truly treated better than trans women at the moment. It is utterly fascinating. Why would anyone put themselves through 20, 30 years of trauma in order to identify as a trans woman, in order to rape women? That is utterly fantastic to think of, isn't it? At my point of my promotion, something they're absolutely terrified of, the consultant team discussed whether they were okay with my homosexuality. Don't get me wrong, I don't care about staring at anyone in a changing room, let alone colleagues. I think the worst thing that you can do is get with a colleague as a potential relationship anywhere. But why would that be a problem in a changing room? Why would that be a problem when it comes down to your consultancy job? Why does it affect their perception of us? Somehow it does. What happens when you report these experiences? Well, guess what? 85% of people don't report ever any of these instances, whether they've experienced it themselves or whether they have witnessed in the first instance. And it's for a number of reasons. You undermine how serious it was in the first instance. I think no matter how small it is, we should raise it or report it. Or potentially you just know that nothing is ever going to be done about it. I remember being scrubbed in a case with one of my bosses at one of my previous jobs, and we were starting to talk, and one of my female trainee, one of my female registrars that was scrubbed in, I was like, started to challenging this boss view. It's like, well, if you don't have a husband, and who would you marry? And I was like, well, could marry a woman. I was like, oh, don't be silly, that's ridiculous. Why would you want to do that? And I was like, and literally remember just being nudged by my colleague. I was like, please shut up. Don't say anything because it's not the right moment. And this happens. We kind of silence each other along the way. On that sad note, I think there's plenty of hope. We are more visible now more than ever, and hopefully I'm going to give you a couple of tools that you can use in your day-to-day job, whether you are queer or not, whether you're an ally, and hopefully you're all allies by this point. Hopefully I've convinced you to be an ally and to stand up. From that report, we think that 69%, so it's like 2/3 of people responding actually agree that our place is more welcoming now than it used to be. It is a safer space. We're able to exist in a number of spaces, potentially not across the entire board, but actually is more welcoming. Yes, trans colleagues have got it worse. Unfortunately, let's remember that. We do agree that senior leadership is more supportive. There is a different generation. The old dinosaurs are slowly retiring or dying off, thankfully. But unfortunately, some of those people exist, and they're still passing on their perception down to towards younger trainees, potentially those younger trainees that have simply been brought up even in a surgical environment that is white, that is male, that is cisgender, that is heterosexual, that has never experienced the level of diversity to recognize that actually any woman is as good as a surgeon as a man, any ethnicity, any race, any sexuality is as good as a surgeon as anyone else. But until you break those ceilings, people do not understand that is going to happen. So I'm going to give you some of the tools, okay? I think we can break them down around language, creating inclusive workplaces, challenging some of the unacceptable behavior, leadership, and intersectionality. The most important thing of them all, I think, is being visible. You do not need a platform with thousands of people. Some people do. You can have Instagram, TikTok, whatever it may be, but you do not necessarily need that platform. You just need to speak to a person one-to-one and so on, allow it to become effectively kind of a Ponzi scheme, just get bigger and bigger and you spread. And even if you can affect and change a single person's mind, that person is likely to affect more people as you go along. So it's really important to inspire representation, something that perhaps I didn't see in medical school. I can potentially be that person along the way, no matter how strong the imposter syndrome actually is along the way, unfortunately. I think it's important to increase awareness. I appreciate that I became aware since being in neurosurgery. There are 4 other colleagues across the country that identify as queer and are out and they're proud, and that's beautiful. We've got 2 more colleagues coming in on the other side that are personally recruited and mentored throughout their application process. I'm really proud of it, and I'm really happy that we're diversifying the workforce, but there's more work to do. And it's really important to challenge some of the stereotypes. That yes, we do all these kind of intersectionality identities. We do work harder to achieve the same goals as white colleagues do, as white male colleagues do. I'm sorry, I don't want to single anyone out, but the reality is that we're just as capable. It's just unfortunately we're having to work harder as we go along. And it's important to amplify those voices. I'm talking from a perspective in neurosurgery where the EDI box at the moment feels very tokenistic. It is happening, but it feels just a tick box that is being done. Yes, we're thinking about EDI, but we're not actually thinking about inclusion and diversity amongst our ranks. And eventually, as you get in, I realize actually you can foster belonging amongst people. I feel like I hope I've done it with the colleagues that are recruited amongst neurosurgery trainees so far and managed to get a job, and they're absolutely brilliant and they deserve it. I'm glad they're also queer, but it's also important to actually foster that sense of belonging once you become a senior. And something that I'm really glad to have actually seen in Birmingham is that nobody cares who my partner is. They literally could not care from that perspective. They care that I'm competent. They care that I'm part of the team. We're still going out. We're still having a drink. I'm still part of the team, and nothing matters from that perspective. But being able to actually reinforce the concept that your sexuality, your gender identities don't matter is really important from that perspective. And potentially, if you feel like being visible in the first place, you might be loud enough and drive systemic change. So I think it's important to have role models, even a single person that you can identify that simply exists, that perhaps doesn't think that their sexuality or gender identity is important to the role that they do in A&E, in their medical specialty, in their surgical environment. But by just existing, they demonstrate to students coming along the way that you can be queer in medicine and it's absolutely fine. It is actually potentially better because we're thinking laterally at some of the identities, some of the issues that patients face in the day-to-day lives. If we don't have a workforce that reflects the care, the population that we're caring for, how can we actually provide truly inclusive care? Inclusive language is tough. I get that it's changing. Everyone is wanting to be politically correct, but it's absolutely fine to make errors. And if you do make an error, apologize and move on. So when people are introducing themselves, just listen carefully how they want to be addressed, whether it's their title. For example, I decided since passing my MRCS, I decided to use MX because I saw one of my fellow members in the PRISM, in the Pride in Surgery forum, to use the same title. And that gender neutrality for me was really important. Actually, I don't want the Mr. title, I really don't. And slowly people across, for example, my theatre team, I started to adopt that, and it's really nice. Think about the pronouns. If someone is using they as their preferred pronoun, so for example, when they give you the pronouns he, they, I'm happy for he to be used as my preferred pronoun. But at the same time, if someone is giving they, he, try to use they in the first instance. It's really difficult to change that language, but I think it's important, even when speaking to patients, who do you live with? Or do you have a partner? Rather than thinking about husband, wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, and so forth, it really changes some of those dynamics. And when you do come across eventually a patient patient or a colleague that identifies as queer, we do pick up on that language. We do see you as an ally. We do see you as someone that is actually understanding, and it's beautiful. It really makes a difference. I sat for the first time in a trust meeting a couple of days ago where everyone was introducing themselves with pronouns, and it's a small things. It's like, and I appreciate it. Somehow it is tokenistic, but at least there is that early thinking about it to begin with. And if you've known someone by a different name in a transition, and they're in a process of transitioning, whether there is just medical, surgical, or simply societally transitioning, please don't that name them. If you do make the mistake, apologize and move on. They don't want you to spend a lot of time on that topic, I promise you. Just hurry yourself along. That's fine. It happens. They understand that. Please be respectful. I know there's a lot of categories. Potentially, you might have never heard about people referring themselves as queer or genderqueer. Perhaps it's the first time that you may come across because I presented you today. Perhaps you have heard it before. But don't ask people very intimate questions. It is, and I'm sorry to say that, it is no one's job to educate our fellow colleagues. If you identify as a Black person, it's not your job to identify other people about race. It is not my job to teach people about race. It's not my job to teach people about sexual identities and sexual orientation and gender identities. Go out, find courses, find resources that are going to help you educate yourself, but don't expect those people with those protected characteristics to educate fellow colleagues. It is tough. It is relentless. We've been asked multiple times across the way, and I'm sorry to put it out there. You will have seen loads of badges out there. You've seen loads of lanyards. I think the lanyard has completely lost any meaning, and at the moment within the NHS, I'm sorry, everyone's got a rainbow lanyard. I'm a BMA representative. We got it. Everyone is wearing it. Do you truly know what you're wearing around your neck? I'm not entirely sure. A lot of people do. The NHS Rainbow Badge Scheme, it was brilliant. They're just currently being refunded, given the NHS England has been dismantled. We're looking at, for example, introducing the more inclusive flag that has got the intersectionality flag with gender identities, with transgender identities, and other sexual orientation. So there's something really coming through. And it's just a small token that when people come across you, they can recognize as a potential ally. That's why I think it's really important for some of those visible key things to be in place. But effectively, if you do hear something that doesn't sound okay, if you can call it out, if you can't, go to someone that might be able to do it in your place in the first instance. And calling out is challenging. I absolutely get it. I will never want to call out some of my bosses. Some of my bosses I certainly don't have a good rapport with. But what does calling out actually mean in the first place? You might be the only person that is able to challenge it. You might not. Think about whether that person is able to defend themselves. Think about the environment that it might be perpetrating. And once can be a mistake. Things happen. Doesn't mean that even if it only happens once, it shouldn't be challenged. Whether that's about race, whether it's about gender, everything should be challenged appropriate to what has happened. But when it happens 2-3 times, it is certainly a pattern, potentially needs escalating. Something that comes across from the Scandinavian countries, we're slowly trying to adopt it here in the UK, but I don't think the NHS is quite ready for it, is the informal cup of conversations. There is a pyramid of escalations. We don't need to blow things out of proportion and take them directly to a formal complaint. The moment things become formal as part of a process, you've shut down informal resolution. But the very easy way to address nearly everything is right at the bottom, to have an informal cup of coffee. Don't have it in the office with your boss, because you've got a desk in between you, you've got a position of power. Take them down to Costa, take them down elsewhere in your theatre coffee room, take them down the corridor, where effectively you're standing at the same level. There is no hierarchy, whereas your colleague, your F1, your senior matron, or whoever they might be, that's the best way to have that early discussion. It might just be that actually they realize, oh yeah, I realized I was out of place, that was absolutely unacceptable, or they might simply double down and simply say, I was like, well, that's my belief, all those trans people are absolutely bonkers, and potentially that's where things need to be escalated. It might not be that perhaps if you've identified something, you're the best person to raise it in the first instance. Do you know that, for example, your boss has got their best mate, and that best mate is someone you can go to because you think they're a more approachable consultant, for example, or more approachable nurse that can speak to the matron. So it's really important to think, what is the best way to raise it in the first instance? And if that doesn't happen, by all means escalate it. But it's very likely that if there is a pattern of offence behind it, other people have been affected in the past. And it might just be that if one person speaks up, eventually more people come forward, as we see with sexual abuse within the community and within the hospital. Education is really important. We're really pressing from a Royal College point of view, as well as the BMA, we're really pressing for more teaching to be present within the undergraduate and postgraduate curriculum. What we currently have at the moment is a lot of stereotyping that has existed across the years, because, you know, your gay man will have HIV in your MRCS case of 2 years ago, and that was reported right away, and they luckily struck it off from their repertoire. But that shouldn't be the case. You shouldn't have to report this in the first instance. As you will have seen, a process that is painfully long, has been painfully long to decolonize the curriculum from a lot of the racist aspect of the education. This is going to take a little bit longer as well, in terms of recognizing that, you know, it's not only needle users that, for example, get hepatitis C. It is not just African Caribbean people that have got raised blood pressure. So it's really important. And there's a bigger work behind it to actually debunk some of the science, so some of the pseudoscience that, for example, is around some of the race outcomes for patients and so forth. Some of it exists, some of it doesn't, but it's really important around the curriculum. There are loads of resources. Your trust will have a module. Your trust or medical school should have an LGBTQ plus group that does deliver some of this teaching. If you feel like it, go on to it. I strongly recommend, just to even understand some of these concepts. As recommended reads, again, it's a tough read. Don't read it in one go. Have a glass of wine, have a cup of tea or a hot chocolate, whatever suits you. But one book that I strongly recommend, so I'm going to move these so you can see it from your perspective, is this, and it's absolutely beautiful. I finished reading it for the second time, and he's really looking at that level of intersectionality of trans identity across the ages. But it just doesn't look at gender identity and their existence, because they didn't used to get called trans, as you know, transgender identities. But it actually looks at sexual orientation as well, and how it fits within different cultures. So the issues that we have with gender and sexual orientation is very much a Western problem. It is not a Native American problem. It is not a South American problem. It didn't used to exist in, for example, some of the native population in further East Asia or Middle Asia. It is very much a Western problem, European and North American problem. So I strongly recommend this book, because it's truly opened my eyes to how we perceive a lot of these things, and why perhaps we truly should think about everyone sitting on a spectrum of identity, on a spectrum of sexual orientation. Sorry. Amazing. I'm sorry that was heavy. I know there is a lot happening behind the scenes. I know that potentially painted a really tough picture to go through, but I think there is a lot of hope. And even if you just take some of this concept away and they sit at the back of your mind, the first time you see a queer patient, it all comes flooding back, and I hope it does come flooding back. Or you got a colleague that comes to you for support, you might just be that friendly face to be able to speak about it, or potentially provide that extra support, or signpost people towards the right resources. So I hope you've taken something away from this. Thank you so much.
Do we have any questions on the Slido? Just to see, because I don't have access of it. I just wanted to ask a question. What could we do as WPMN better to help raise awareness? And yeah, what do you think we could do as a charity organisation?
No, absolutely. I think I'm not sure if you guys have got, for example, a mentor scheme, for example, or something like it. But if someone was to specifically identify, is there a part of your identity, something that is intrinsic to you that you're particularly keen and want to represent, or perhaps you don't see represented within the medical profession? If people are thinking about students or doctors looking at training, that is important to them. If you can match them with someone that can help, or whether you wanted to develop a small set of resources to signpost people to Stonewall. The Stonewall website has got loads. We're trying to develop more stuff for the BMA as well as the Royal College of Surgeons. But I think the most important thing is visibility. Just knowing that even when I remember coming out, for example, to my family, and the main question that I've always had is that they've always had, oh, but why does it matter that you come out? Why can you not just keep it behind your closed doors? Nobody cares. It matters because we must be visible, even just existing. I know it does not matter for my clinical competence how I do a tumor operation or whatever it may be. I know it doesn't matter, but what it matters is that someone is coming to observe the surgery, or the patient feels they've got a doctor they can empathize with, they can be represented by. And it kind of warms your heart as you get, for example, I've had 2 queer couples coming to clinic in the last 6 or 7 months, and it was brilliant to recognize, like, okay, you're clearly a queer doctor, that's brilliant, that's fine. whatever they've identified from it, I don't mind, but is you get a very different report once you break some of those barriers, that you feel like you can report with your doctor a little bit more. In the same way I've had students shadowing me, we have a very different report to other colleagues, for example.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Isabel. I really appreciate it. Thank you, guys.